Hello, my AMST 140 students. This is Professor Collins. It is Monday, March 23rd, 2020. Hopefully all of you are healthy or as healthy as can be expected. If you're not healthy, quarantining or self-isolating yourselves or somehow taking medications and everything else that you need to do in order to make sure that you're okay. Otherwise, hi. So it's week 11. And we're past gentrification, but not really. We're talking about other things related to gentrification. So I want to make sure, though, before we do anything else, to assure you of one thing. I've already posted it in announcements. I've already told several students who showed up for the Saturday Skype video conferencing / discussion period this, but I want to make sure that it is clear. I do not, absolutely do not want you worrying about your grades at this point. My feeling is, I cannot absolutely promise this for every student because it depends on your effort, your ability to self-discipline enough, to do enough work, to show enough effort. But generally speaking, if you do the work that you're supposed to do for the remainder of the course, your 2 reflections, your group project, show up for discussions. I don't expect you to be at every discussion. I suspect that some of you are probably only going to make 3 of them. But if you do that, if you do those things, you'll end up either with an A or an A-, period. It won't. I'm not saying that you have to hand me schlock. I mean, when I say effort, I mean it's relevant, it's on topic, you've done research, you've looked up stuff, you've looked up interviews, you've made it relevant to your topic, you've tried to work with your partner if you're in the group project, you've cited sources if you're writing a paper. So it's not just simply here's stuff that looks like it could be a paper if someone took 2 weeks to edit it. It still has to look like a paper. It still has to look like you put some effort into your project. But beyond that, am I expecting polished work? Am I expecting you to do the best interviews? Am I expecting you to contact people who might be in an ICU at a hospital because they have pneumonia? No, I'm not expecting that. So that's why I'm saying I'm trying to give you flexibility in terms of deadlines. And I will give more flexibility if needed because we're not consistently all going to have Wi-Fi or electricity or cable or the ability to look up this stuff, and that stuff isn't equally distributed across classmates. Not every classmate is a 2 comma kid. Right? Not every classmate has parents making $100,000 or more a year. Not every classmate lives in neighborhoods where they have good Wi-Fi access. So I will take all of that into account. But the bottom line is put forth the effort to get through this. With enough reasonableness around how well you do your assignments in terms of effort. A or A-, period. Full stop. So I know for the grinders in this course, and I know what grinders look like. I went through a magnet program for 6 years, went to college with grinders and did honors college work, and went to graduate school. I used to be a grinder. A's were like eating ice cream on a hot, sunny summer day, and just like it was great. It was like making a 3-point shot against somebody with their hands outstretched and knocking it down. I loved A's. But I also learned that A's weren't everything. And so for those grinders that are a part of the course, I want to make sure that you understand that obviously you would have probably ended up with an A or an A-, whether this course was face-to-face and going through the normal course of taking a face-to-face course at AU, or you've gotten an A if you did it at Harvard or Georgetown or whatever. That's fine. That's great for you. But given where we are right now, I want to make sure that everyone gets credit for trying to do the work that this course is trying to get you, and trying to remember the themes of this course and understand what we're supposed to learn around DC, the DMV, culture, history, anthropology, anthropologically and otherwise, in terms of how we understand the cultures of DC, how DC is developed, and so on and so forth. And doing that in the context of what we're going through now requires effort on a scale that I wouldn't, that for some people might be hard for them to pull up, and for other people, because you're a grinder, it might be easier. So in that sense, everyone's sort of evening out here in terms of grades, and I just want all of us be able to get through this. All of us. And so if that means that there's a bit of grade inflation here for you grinders, I guess that's kind of too bad, right? So, oh well. But otherwise, everyone should be fine in terms of where we are. And I want you not to worry about, I don't want this to be a worry in the middle of everything else that's going on. So, all right, that's set. Now, as to what we're doing for week 11, the theme for this week is immigrant and suburban communities in D.C. And the main thing, there are basically 5 things that you should take from the readings this week and from the recordings for this week, is that D.C. has become a cosmopolitan city in the last 50 or 60 years. Cosmopolitan, metropolitan, uber cosmopolitan, and metropolitan. You're not going to find much greater diversity outside of DC, except maybe in New York, or Los Angeles, or San Francisco. You're just not. But the dynamic in terms of numbers and diversity, really, for DC in particular, really depends on suburban communities. Without the suburbs, DC is basically, it's a city of about 700,000 people, but it's a mostly black and mostly white city. That is until basically the tail end of the 1990s and the early part of the 21st century. You already know this. But that gets to one of the key themes historically about DC, is that unlike most of the cities in the United States throughout the 19th and first half of the 20th century, DC is not a destination for European and Asian immigrants. It's just not, period. DC's, even at the height of the immigration period in the United States, which was roughly between 1870 and 1920, DC has a population of maybe at most 30,000 foreign-born immigrants from Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, Greece, Croats, etc., 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 Eastern and Southern Eastern European folk. That's it. A few Germans founded some breweries in the 19th century. Folks settled in the area that is now where the Lincoln Memorial is, and Jefferson Memorial, and across what's now the National Mall, when and built shanty towns and maybe many ethnic enclaves in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century. But by 1930, those are gone. Just gone. They've been uprooted through what we would now call gentrification, actually, via eminent domain and urban renewal in the 1920s and 30s. And so those communities are few and far in between. And for me to spend significant time on those communities, well, I couldn't do it possible justice, and the numbers are so small. Even at the height of European immigration that led to folks moving to D.C., you're talking small numbers, maybe 300 Greeks, maybe 1,000 Italians, 3,000 Jews from different parts of Europe. That's it. That's what we're talking about in numbers. Even Chinatown, maybe at its height, 3,000 Chinese who moved either directly from China in the late 19th century or moved before the Chinese Exclusion Act took its hold in 1882, or from the West Coast to the East Coast over time. And because of the nature of this city, a city that is basically built around the federal government, you're not getting lots of unskilled workers moving here. You're getting folks moving here who are starting businesses, little mom and pop shops or restaurants or groceries, type of things, or wholesalers, or in the case of the Germans, making beer kinds of things. Or you're getting folks who have specific skills, like folks who can work for the government, folks who can be stenographers, or office type folks, or delivering mail. Those are the kinds of folks who are moving here. Or if they're immigrants from Europe, maybe they're masons, they do masonry work, they do construction work, they build roads, those kinds of things. They know how to lay tar, they're carpenters. Those are the kinds of folks who tend to move here from these immigrant communities, and not specifically from Europe and from Asia prior to 1960. But modern day immigration in DC really starts in the 60s and takes off in the 1970s. And it's from places that, really for most Americans isn't typical, right? The largest communities that are here in DC are communities from East Africa, from Central America, and from Taiwan. Yeah, I know. That doesn't mean most people automatically think, where do you think immigrants come from who live in DC? And probably people would say, oh, well, Mexico or Cuba, or they'd probably say China, mainland China, or they'd say something like that. It's not true. There are really about 2 or 3 different waves of immigration into DC between 1960 and the present. One is the 1970s and early 80s. Primarily from Ethiopia, although you'd get a bit from Eritrea and Somalia as well, of East Africans moving to DC. It starts with the collapse of the Ethiopian government in the early 1970s, which was once ruled by the Emperor Haile Selassie, for those of you who know your East African history. When he dies and the government collapses, a lot of Ethiopian folk who lived in the city, and maybe a few hundred who worked for the Ethiopian embassy and its consulates, were stuck. And so the U.S. started giving asylum to Ethiopians living in D.C. And that basically started a formal chain of migration when the Ethiopian Civil War fully breaks out in the late 1970s. And so the U.S. government is giving almost blanket asylum to anyone who's coming from Ethiopia, from Eritrea, because some of this stuff spills over there, and certainly from Somalia as well, because Ethiopians and Somalians were fighting too, and gave them the ability to become refugees and move to D.C. Gave them business loans so they could start businesses. And where did they start businesses? In Shaw, on U Street, in parts of Adams Morgan, as well as in Columbia Heights, so in Mount Rainier. All those neighborhoods end up getting Ethiopian businesses, and that's sort of the anchor that leads to what some folks for about 15 or 20 years were calling Little Ethiopia, and parts of what's now Shaw, and parts in Logan Circle and other places around that part of D.C. Those people eventually moved out to the suburbs, moved to Montgomery County, Maryland, and moved to Prince George's County, Maryland. Some even moved to Howard County, Maryland. Some moved south to Arlington County and Alexandria and other parts of the DMV. But that's the first wave. You get another wave of immigrants from El Salvador, because El Salvador went through a civil war in the 1980s as well. And so that starts a chain of migration leading to folks moving to D.C. in the period of the 1980s and early 90s as well. And so when you look at Columbia Heights and the fact that so many of the shops there serve pupusas, it's because those people are Salvadoran, right? If they had been, say, from Mexico, maybe they'd serve tacos, or other Tex-Mex kinds of things. But typically they serve Salvadoran food because they're the largest single group of Central American Latinos or Latinx folk living in D.C. and the DMV. They also later move out to Montgomery County, Maryland, and Prince George's County, Maryland, and throughout the rest of the DMV. And then you have another group of folks who are coming to D.C. in a more steady pace, not due to civil war, but just plain old migration. And there are Taiwanese. You have 2 groups of Asian folk who live in the DMV and in DC. There's Little Korea in Fairfax County. There's a large segment of Vietnamese folk who live in Fairfax County, Virginia as well. But the truth is that the primary group of Asians moving here post-1970 are Taiwanese. You get a few from mainland China. A lot of those folks either stay because they've earned their degree and they find work here, or because they're seeking asylum. But Taiwanese are moving here because they just want to move here. Maybe they're highly educated. They find work in the international development community and other communities, end up moving to D.C. But they are not the same as the folks who live in Chinatown. Chinatown itself has fewer than 300 Chinese residents in it, depending on how you define the size and scope of Chinatown. Most of those residents live in two high-rises off of Chinatown around Gallery Place, excuse me. So when you think about all of that, and you think about these groups coming to the DMV, you think about the fact that even though there are immigrant communities here, there are not really immigrant enclaves here outside of parts of Columbia Heights, parts of Shaw, parts of Chinatown, and really it's not even that big. We're talking about 3 to 5 blocks. It leads to really when we get to this whole thing around suburbanization in DC and looking at the suburbs. DC is basically bigger than the sum of its parts when you think about the DMV. As of today, there are about 700,000 people who live in Washington, D.C., but there are more than 7 million people who live in the general area known as the DMV, 7.2 or so. And the DMV is pretty much well defined as Howard County, Prince George's, and Montgomery County, Maryland, as well as Arlington, Fairfax, Prince William and Loudoun County, and the city of Alexandria. That's the DMV. Some people might include Anne Arundel County. It's debatable. Some people include Baltimore County, but if you're going to include Baltimore County, you have to include Baltimore. And when you do that, you push the total population of the Baltimore-Washington metropolitan area to almost 10 million people, making it one of the 6 largest or 4 largest metropolitan areas in the entire United States. Either way, that's a lot of folks. There are about 1 million immigrants out of that grouping that covers that whole large area between Baltimore and Northern Virginia. Only 1 out of 4 of those folks, happen to be Salvadoran. They're the largest single group that lives in the DMV, about 260,000 folks. A good portion of those folks live in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Prince George's County, Maryland. So the largest single group of immigrants to the area are Salvadoran. Out of that 1 million, only about 100,000 immigrants live in D.C. So the dynamic is that the DMV is actually more diverse as a whole than D.C. is. Matter of fact, Montgomery County, Maryland is majority people of color, majority black, majority African black, majority American black, majority Latinx, majority Asian. That's the bulk of the people. There are almost 1 million people who live in Montgomery County, Maryland, 265,000 in Silver Spring, Maryland alone. And it's much more diverse because we have a huge immigrant population in Montgomery County, Maryland, just as a for instance. So DC itself doesn't seem very immigrant friendly, but the DMV as a whole is hugely immigrant friendly. And it leads to different dynamics in terms of understanding the different cultures that make up the DMV and make up DC itself. You definitely see immigrant influences in DC, but at the same time you have to understand that even though you see all those influences, that DC itself is primarily a black-white town, with 48% of the town still being African American. And by African American, I mean American black, right? And with another 40% of the town being white, 40, 41, 42%, somewhere in that range. No one has a majority, but blacks are still the plurality of the city, whereas 1 out of every 6 residents in the overall DMV, somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 7, happen to be immigrant. So there's a much greater concentration of immigrant communities outside of DC than within. And that leads to interesting dynamics in communities that used to be lily white, like Montgomery County, Maryland, that had been historically 90%, 80% white through the 70s. Prince George's County, which went from being majority white to majority black to now black and of color with large immigrant communities. Same thing goes even with Fairfax County, with a population of 1.2 million people, but a greater percentage of that happens to be immigrant communities, mostly Asian immigrant communities in this case. All that's to say that this is very complicated, so do your readings and try to get a grip on this before we start asking questions and talking about these dynamics this week.